For decades, we've heard the same story about quantum computing.
So people even say that's always the technology that's coming in 5 or 10 years. We are investors in quantum technologies at Quantonation, and I'm deeply convinced, indeed, this is the time.
What changed? The breakthrough that's turning century-old science into today's hottest market.
But we're on a path where companies are showing larger computers, and I think that's an important aspect. But I think the combination of AI and quantum will accelerate the adoption and the applications of quantum technologies, using AI for quantum, but also quantum to improve AI.
But here's the proof that skeptics can't ignore.
Qubit Pharmaceuticals, the team is strong of about 50 people. So they have shown a few months ago that you can use GPUs and quantum processors in order to generate so-called synthetic data to train foundation models, and ultimately to have an agent that's going to be very expert at quantum chemistry.
Yet there's one critical gap that could determine who wins this race.
Europe is definitely very strong and very well positioned for early stage. Where capital is missing, in particular for European startups, it's really later stage.
The window is closing. Here's what quantum investor Christophe Jurczak wants you to know.
Quantum is not science fiction anymore. Quantum is real. You have companies, you have strong ecosystems developing machines, products. It's not just science anymore.
Don't miss this deep dive into quantum's commercial breakthrough. Available now on the EUVC podcast.
This was their finest hour.
Tear down this wall.
It's more than just an alliance. This is a union of values.
Let's start acting.
This show is not investment advice, and the hosts of this episode may be invested in the funds and companies featured.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the EUVC podcast. Today, we're diving into the convergence of quantum computing, AI, and blockchain with Christophe Jurczak from Quantonation. With recent developments like NVIDIA's CEO Jensen Huang declaring quantum computing at an inflection point and Multiverse Computing's impressive $215 million funding round to compress large language models by up to 95%, the landscape is rapidly evolving. Christophe, with his extensive experience in quantum technologies, will shed light on how these advancements are not just theoretical, but actively shaping the industries today. So Christophe, we've all seen the headlines, NVIDIA calling this an inflection point, time saying the quantum era's already begun. But is this hype or is it a real paradigm shift?
Yeah, good question. And hi, Andreas. Thanks for having me. Yeah, we've seen that, these kind of headlines for a while. I think that's, and some people even say that's always the technology that's coming in 5 or 10 years. So it's really a legitimate question to ask oneself, is it really the beginning of something? Are we at the inflection point as the quantum era began? So showing a couple of illustrations here, but we've seen that over time. We are investors in quantum technologies at Quantonation, and I'm deeply convinced, indeed, this is the time. We have invested since 2018, I came back into the sector since 2016, and I want to show you a couple of funny pictures, maybe to start with, because I think that's really important. What you need to have in this kind of sector is really the expertise to understand at what stage you are. Here is a picture of me somewhere with a little bit more hair here on the right, with Professor Aspe with the mustache on the left. He's the Nobel Prize 2022 for quantum physics, and I was doing my PhD at the time in the 90s. In a physics labs, turning the knobs, adjusting lasers and these things. So really the beginning of quantum applications, really. Quantum science is much older, obviously. And then fantastic thing is that 30 years later, that's a picture we took last year. It's me again with Professor Aspect after Nobel Prize, it's collected in 2022, and he's working with us. And the industry has dramatically changed, whereas in the 90s, we were doing science, very fundamental things. Without really too much of a view on what it would be good for. Now, these days, there are startups in that sector, so there are young people like the one on the picture who take a job in quantum technologies, quantum startups, quantum funds. And Alain, we're very fortunate to have him still with us. And a message I want to give, maybe to start with, and we'll illustrate that with a couple of applications, which I think make a lot of sense, is that this is a science that's relatively old. It's beginning of the 20th century. Everybody knows this picture from the Solvay conference, 1927. You see very familiar faces, Einstein, Marie Curie, Schrödinger, Heisenberg, etc. So the science is relatively old. Well, it's mature. It's 100 years, actually. We're celebrating that this year, 2 years earlier than that. That's a year of quantum officially for United Nations. But what is really interesting and important is that now in 2025, we start really to develop applications in a way in the operating system of the world, which is quantum mechanics, not Newtonian physics, 19th century or even earlier, 18th, 19th and 20th century classical mechanics. Now we can leverage this science, we can build applications in compute, sensing, and I think that's the inflection point people are talking about. That's why it's so exciting. And we definitely see an acceleration in science. You need a lot of fundamental science, hardware, machines, engineering, and also applications. Now that I've introduced you to this idea of the world operating system based on quantum mechanics, I want to show a few applications that our portfolio companies in the fund are working on in 4 sectors: healthcare, energy, security, climate, shown here. And we'll talk about AI a little bit later, and I'll have more to say about that. But these ones, I think, are pretty spectacular. These are real things, real applications companies are working on. This is not science fiction. I think that's the important thing to keep in mind. So the 4 segments I want to talk about, so health, energy, security, climate, a bit about compute as well, giving some example of companies and markets. So the first one in healthcare, it's actually a use case, 2 companies in our portfolio: Pascal, which is a quantum computing company, hardware, and Qubit Pharmaceuticals, which is a software company, are working on. They're using quantum processors to design molecules for new drugs. They use the power of quantum computers that are inherently good at doing simulation of chemistry in order to develop new molecules that would be less toxic, more effective, have a better, let's say, impact on the target. And above all, also, they're using, so Pascal and Qubit, this technology to shorten the time it takes to develop a molecule. Instead of doing lots of experimentations, you can substitute part of it with a compute part, so-called in silico, and reduce with classical and quantum computers the time to deliver these molecules. This is still early days, but we have good evidence that using quantum computers here, we get to new molecules, new materials as well. This is a use case which I think is definitely the most important in the short term, to get materials for catalysts, for example, new forms of catalysts. And that's really, let's say, in a way, the killer app for quantum computing, in my opinion, in the short term, designing molecules. And of course, the markets are really big, a couple $100 billion at some point. It is very small market for now, but it's true for everything in quantum. But it's poised to grow quite a bit over the next couple of years, as soon as we will have better machines and better software as well.
Can you just, on this specific application for health and maybe even for all of them going forward, talk a little bit about the inflection point, or why you think now is actually the time? Because that's what many, of course, are fearing or thinking around quantum, is that we've for a long time been saying now is the time, and then it's not been the time.
Yeah. So the reason why I believe that now is the time, so there are 2 reasons actually. So one is that machines are progressing and reaching a number of qubits. So qubits are the unit of information quantum computers are built on, as opposed to bits for classical regular processors. So one thing that is important, so there are many parameters which describe quantum computers, but you need a relatively large number of qubits in order to perform complex computations. So we have reached a point with certain technologies, that's the case for neutral atoms here with the company Pascal, with superconducting technologies. It's another way to do a quantum computers with IDM in particular, also with ions, where you have hundreds of qubits as opposed to a couple or tens. And you need that in order to be able to process complex things. So people say you need thousands, tens of thousands, maybe millions. For sure, the more, the better. But we're on a path where companies are showing larger computers. And I think that's an important aspect. The other aspect is that the way people are approaching applications is shifting a little bit. I think we'll talk a little bit later about that as well, but I think the combination of AI and quantum, which is really new this year, essentially, or let's say over the last year, will accelerate the adoption and the applications of quantum technologies, using AI for quantum, but also quantum to improve AI. And I think that's completely new, very disruptive, and that's a way to accelerate the path to applications. And as you said, to go beyond the inflection point.
Can you describe in a little more detail what is that revolution here, so to say? Why is it that the application of AI or the coupling of AI and quantum is actually so powerful?
A very recent development that's made by Qubit Pharmaceuticals, again, company in our portfolio. They're based in France and in the US. The team is strong of about 50 people. The computational chemists, they're developing molecules. So they have shown a few months ago that you can use classical, so GPUs, and quantum processors in order to generate so-called synthetic data to train foundation models. And ultimately, to have an agent that's going to be very expert at quantum chemistry is going to be able to generate new molecules. The novelty here is that you can use these technologies of compute to train the model. Usually people were doing, let's say, more traditional simulations, simulate directly the chemistry in the very deterministic mode. So you simulate the chemistry, the reaction, the dynamics, and you get the end result. I think here the new thing that they have shown, which in my mind is very, very important and will have a quite profound impact, that you can use even relatively imperfect quantum computers. So the ones we have now that are not completely mature, hundreds of qubits I mentioned earlier, tens of qubits even, without error correction, might come into it, but you can use these machines as they are to generate data and train a model. It's not an LLM like we have in a large language model. It's a different form of model. It's a foundation model. That's what it's called. That's going to be a top expert in quantum chemistry. So this combination of training the model with quantum is very new. In the words of one of the founders of Qubit, it's going to accelerate the adoption of quantum computers by 5 years, he said. I tend to believe that it's true, actually. That's the kind of combination using classical, quantum, AI together in a very in a good synergy that's going to get to accelerate adoption and get to have more applications in the short term.
All right, let's go back to the other use cases, exemplified, of course, by the established portfolio.
Another use case that I find very exciting, it's also in the field of materials. So it's not related to quantum computing in that case, but it's a company that we have in France. It's called Pionic. They're developing new materials for energy storage without lithium, without cobalt, and they're using so-called quantum materials. What's really interesting here is not the usual applications that you have in mind, which are compute, communication with quantum technologies, but you can also use quantum technologies directly for materials for energy. So these are materials in the sense that there are quantum materials, that there are very strong correlations between the components, electrons, atoms, that cannot be described in a, let's say, semi-classical approximation. So it's a bit technical and tricky, I'll admit, but it's new classes of materials for new applications. That's the thing to keep in mind. And we were not able, without quantum science, quantum computers, to understand actually how these materials behave, how you can get to have them of really exciting electric properties like we have with these materials. It's a good example. It's a pre-seed company we've invested in 18 months ago. Now we're they're raising a seed round, so progressing. The science is improving. I was in the board a few days ago. They're showing devices. They're showing how the technology is getting there. Of course, the markets are huge. It's market for energy storage, not necessarily mobility, but stationary energy storage, large batteries, but also maybe more in short term, in that case, very small batteries, like, the kind that you can find in a phone or anything, electronic cards. And that's super interesting because in a way, that's quantum technologies that's finally reaching people. That's something that we're told often, what is it good for? And it's true that it's usually applications in so-called B2B sectors for industry. It's hard to see applications that have a direct impact, like AI, for example, as with LLMs or things like that. In quantum, it's a little bit more indirect, except in that kind of situation, we will have quantum materials, ultimately, that maybe they will make it into your smartwatch. So quantum technology that's going to generate the energy that you need for your devices. And I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind. Quantum is coming also to applications that are closer to people. And that's something we're very interested in. In that specific case, it's material that's safe, doesn't burn. You have many issues with lithium, as you know. And of course, it's not dependent on geopolitical issues. So, and it's a quantum material at room temperature. So very excited about this one. Very new, very early, but that's the kind of thing that we are really interested in. And I think more of this kind of idea will come over the next couple of years.
It is incredibly exciting. Let's just talk security, climate, and compute just real quick.
Yeah, I will talk about, I will introduce an application that I think is very, very exciting, field of climate, maybe to start with. So it's a company you've mentioned, Andreas, a bit earlier, fundraised by Multiverse. So obviously a company that has raised Series B around 215 million. We've been investors from the beginning. It's a Spanish company, made in Europe. I think for this podcast is very important. So they have been developing a technology that's called tensor networks. Multiverse has been founded by physicists who are really experts at least mathematical formalism. So tensor networks are a tool that's used to describe interactions in quantum systems. So again, it seems a little bit abstract, but the thing that is impressive is that over the years, they have been able to find an application that's really amazing. They use this technology, tensor networks, this mathematical formalism, to compress large language models and to make them more efficient, the kind of chatbots, actually, you're talking to. So they can, and as you know, probably chatbots and LLMs consume a lot of electricity in particular and have a very big impact on the environment. Of course, we're looking for ways to minimize that. And this technology, that's so-called quantum inspired because it's running on classical computers, GPUs, but the formalism and the idea and the science is coming from quantum. So it's a bit of a combination, classical hardware, quantum science, in order to improve an application, again, for every day. So increase the speed of training the models, reduce the cost of running them because you're reducing the energy consumption in particular for training and inference as well. So it's a very beautiful combination of quantum science, quantum technology, and AI. Again, I think there's a little bit of a pattern here to get to applications in the short term. And it's today. I think this is an application that you can find on AWS, for example. You can go to their website, use it. Many people are using it. They're generating revenues with that. So it's, again, quantum today, something that's not, as mentioned earlier, in the realm of science fiction. And the last application I wanted to talk about, maybe as an introduction, is in the field of communication. It's a company that's based in the US. It's called Qubit. Showing on here the network they have been developing. So they're using a photonic network, optical fiber network that we have all over the world. In that case, there's one in New York and one in Berlin. They have been using these networks to send single photons over the networks, one at a time, in a way, to implement new forms of communications. So why would you do something like that? Usually you would use many, many photons with lasers to communicate. Here, the idea is that with single photons, you can generate quantum effects, so-called entanglement. For example, generate two pairs of photons where the photons are connected to each other. And that has a profound impact on communication, on the way you secure communication between parties. Again, it's a bit challenging to get the intuition of that, I will admit. But essentially, that's a system that's not hackable. So supremely safe against hackers. Again, early days, but real deployments, true deployments. New York, Berlin. So that's a kind of technology. That's the future of the internet, actually. It's called quantum internet. That's going to come over the next couple of years. New forms of infrastructures using existing networks. And to protect, it's a bit sad to say, but to protect essentially against the power of quantum computers. Because quantum computers are super strong in principle at breaking encryption. There are some particularities. There's an algorithm that has been developed for that specifically about 30 years ago. So we need to protect against that threat that will happen at some point. And this is also with quantum technologies that we're finding the solution. So very beautiful use case, deployment now, machines that work. You see on the picture, we have a nice cabinets, including all the technologies, no cooling, room temperature. And that's something that you can implement on existing infrastructure. You don't need to build completely new communication infrastructure. Leverage what you have, substitute the equipment, and get to, the quantum internet, actually, which is pretty cool.
Going from this deep dive into applications and where you can very clearly hear that there's a lot of science you need to understand here, maybe not to listen to this episode, but to be able to diligence a company and a solution and see if you actually want to invest. Maybe you can talk a bit about the importance of coming from a quantum background or truly understanding quantum if you want to be a successful investor in this space.
One of the biggest challenge for making investments in quantum, and back to the first things we've discussed, is really for investor to be able to make a difference between what's hype, so pure speculation and fantasy in many ways, and what's real. And how to make the distinctions is really hard for venture capital in particular. So you can ask experts, of course, you can ask scientists to help you understand, but usually pure scientists, I mean, they don't necessarily, they're missing a little bit, I would say they lack a little bit of imagination, because you need to have a bit of imagination to figure out what the technology will be good for without hiding the challenges. So if you focus too much on the challenges, you're not going to develop new applications. And if you're a little bit too speculative, you overlook the challenges. So what we're doing, I think the way to go is definitely in a venture fund that's interested in investing in quantum science, in deep tech in general. I think it's really you have to have in the team, in particular in the investment committee, team members who have a background in the science, actually, in physics. So at Quantonation, we have 3 partners, and it's a good combination because we have 2. I've done a PhD in quantum physics in the end of the 90s with Andreas, another partner with Zeng, who's done his PhD in the UK, in Oxford, and has worked in a quantum startup as well, hardware and software before joining the fund. And Olivier Tonneau was more of a more classical VC background. So this combination is great, but it's in the investment committee. It's not just a question of advisor. I mean, you need to form a vision, of a conviction, and I think that's what is really key in what we're doing. And that's something I'd like to see more in VCs, get the expertise very deeply into the team, so that there's really a true ambition and a true vision on the application of these technologies, not just consulting experts who get you to make a decision. And that's very, very important, particularly if you want to be a lead investor, lead followers, and of course, that's different. So investors who want to have access into quantum as a follower, I think you don't necessarily need that, I will agree, to have a very strong expertise. But if you want to be a lead investor, and we need more lead investors, in particular in Europe, I think it's really important to have the expertise into the team.
Yeah, I don't know if I would say that I frown on people that think that they can diligence their way through something difficult by using consultants or advisors, because it is wrought with a lot of problems. And I have at least personally seen how researchers can have very differing views, and we've seen so many cases where obviously the professors and the so-called experts are completely unable to see what the founders are able to see. And I think that as a VC investing in this space, you got to have that taste, you got to have that understanding yourself, so you can go and live the world of the founder, so to say, because otherwise you're not going to be, you cannot expect a researcher, despite them being experts, to be able to go into a founder's vision and view on things. Also because it's often contrarian. So by definition, if you go to a broad group, then you should get, or to an expert that is very much an expert in the usual world, you will automatically get the wrong conclusion.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to build on that a little bit, because I think that's a very topic as well. I want to show you a couple of things about one of our portfolio companies, which is called Pascal in quantum computing. They're developing machines, quantum hardware. As you can see on the picture here, this is a quantum computer. A real one is a supercomputing center. There's one in France that has been installed. There's one in Germany. in Jülich, close to Cologne. That's being installed at the moment. There will be in Italy, Saudi Arabia, etc. So we're very far from the lab. I think it started in the lab, 2019, with researchers. Now we're building, shipping machines, putting them in planes, sending them all over the world, installing. That's challenging. But then you have access through the cloud, etc. The thing I want to mention is that what I've been impressed with is that I think scientists don't underestimate a little bit the power of engineering, actually. So once you have the science done, it takes a lot of time, decades, and we need more fundamental science. But then after that, and that's what I've seen at Pascal, a really impressive way they have been able to integrate the components, make it reliable. And once you're there, you have let's say, again, maybe this notion of inflection point is valid here as well. Once you have this engineered device, I think things get much faster, actually. Scientists tend to underestimate the power of engineering and and what startups can do. And I think that to me is amazing. With engineering, with VC, with kind of thing that we're doing, I see companies progressing even much faster than I would have anticipated a couple of years ago. And that's the thing that's happening in the quantum field now, putting bright minds, putting money, of course, into these companies. Also combining different kind of talents. What's really key, what you can do in a startup very well is combining computer scientists with physicists, for example, and working together on applications. That's also something that Pascal is doing on graph machine learning, this kind of thing. It's really hard to do in the lab or in the academic world. Interdisciplinarity is not something that's easy to deal with. In a company, I'd say, well, but literally, you put the people in the same room and you ask them to work together. Computer science with physics is very, very powerful, I think, and that's the way to go for applications in particular.
I'd love to ask you about the financing risk of this space. Is there enough capital? Because when you come in as a believer like you, it can be tempting, to bet on a technology that the rest of the market is not there yet.
So there's enough and not enough. So, but in different ways, I'd say, for quantums. So, for first thing to keep in mind that this sector has started relatively recently. So I tend to put the starting point in 2016 when IBM put a couple of qubits online and their machine was accessible for people to program, work with, and the ecosystem was developed around that. And I mean, for me, that was also one of the drivers for me to come back from where I was in renewable energy, actually, at the time, back to quantum, because I felt like, something had happened. It was maybe also an inflection point, a different one, but that was definitely for me an eye-opener. So 16, 17. And then we started investing at Quantonation in 2018, so very early, because we had the strong conviction that the operating system of the world was quantum, and then it was the right time to get in. It started heating up for VC, venture capital, a bit later, 2021, 2022, about 2 billion and a half of VC money getting into quantum. It seems big, but it's not, actually. I think when you look at AI, it's hundreds of billions of dollars for VC money that's going into quantum. So still relatively small, but things are progressing. So 23 for everybody has been a little bit tough. But this year, 24 and 25, we see really an increase of capital investments in quantum. I think half of the year, we're already at 2.5 billion this year in 2025. So probably we'll get 4-5 billion. So a radical increase, doubling pretty much of capital that's going into quantum this year. One reason for that is that companies are maturing, so getting to Series B, Series C, the rounds are bigger, and therefore they need more capital. But again, it's not enough in the sense of, I think there's a bit of a lack of late-stage venture capital for quantum, in particular in Europe. There are many good companies. Europe has been very strong at developing an ecosystem in quantum technology, combining public and private capital, a European flagship, a very strong ecosystem for Deeptech VC in many countries, France, Germany, now Italy as well, also in the Netherlands, UK, obviously, and Nordic. I mentioned them, and now Spain as well, with Multiverse. So very strong in the early stages. I tend to say even, because we're also investors in the US or other parts of the world, Australia. In Europe, it's definitely very strong and very well positioned for early stage. Where capital is missing, in particular for European startups. It's really later stage growth, deep tech, Series B plus, where you need to build rounds at 100, 200 million around, and above all, find a lead investor who has the conviction, get there. Because where it's tricky is that obviously there are revenues for these companies, and it's in the tens of millions, so it starts to be substantial, and it's not grants, it's revenues, procuring machines and services, software applications, etc. But you have to find investors who have a strong conviction to issue a term sheet and be a lead for these kind of deals. And then you find investors to follow and interested in being in. But what's missing, I'd say that it's improving, but what's in particular in Europe is a bit of a challenge, is really the growth capital. The second part of the life of the company, when they start to generate revenues, but need to invest a lot in business development, commercialization, industrialization.
Is quantum a space that is wrought with geopolitical considerations from governments? And I ask, one thing is, of course, the dedication to making sure that we're at the forefront research-wise. That tends to be something we're good at and are very effectively working on in Europe. But do we have a similar focus on making sure that we are building European sovereignty and resilience when it comes to the later stages and actually building this out as an industry in Europe?
Given the potential impact of quantum, so for, let's say, peaceful applications that I've mentioned, drug design, things like that, materials, but also the risk it represents, because again, a very strong, capable quantum computers represent a threat as well because of this threat to encryption. For these two reasons, it's very clear that most governments, and I think, most governments around the world, I can't think of one that has not shown an interest actually, are really fearing being left out. So they want to be in, they want to make sure they have access to the technology, and they don't want to risk being left behind and maybe just not be able to use quantum computers, because you need to make big investments in hardware in particular in order to access these machines. You need to procure them, to buy them. But definitely at some point, somebody could the cord and you're left with no access to this machine. So we're seeing quite a bit of initiatives in several geographies. Usual suspects, that's of course US, Canada, and European countries, Singapore, Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Japan, etc. Want to make sure they have the capabilities both on the hardware side, on the application side, and they are developing plans and strategies to get there and not to be left behind.
You have a very mind-boggling chart on the on your slide. We're looking at it right now for those that want to see it. You're writing government is doubling down on the support, and then you're writing that $61 billion has been invested in public R&D in founding a new industry of quantum tech. Then you're showing that 48.2% of that investment is in Asia, 40.2% of that is in Europe, and then only 10.7% of that is in America. That is not the normal distribution that we see when we see tech being described and who funds what. Can you talk a bit about and maybe explain to everyone why is it that the US is so behind or not investing in this?
Yeah, so it's a little bit misleading because that's public R&D. On the other end, if you're adding the private money, IBM, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, etc., what they're putting into quantum, they're definitely in the lead. The combination of public and private capital. Another thing that's a little bit misleading in this number that many people use, including us, is that we don't know. So the big part for Asia is coming from China, but we don't know exactly that what that number is. I mean, they're developing a very strong program. That's very clear.
Asia is likely much, much higher. And if you included the main companies in the US, and yes, you're absolutely right. Of course, US R&D is very much driven by the private sector.
But Europe is not left behind. I think that's the key message. Maybe there's of course less private investment, but on the public side, I mean, and the national plans plus the work of the level of the European Union, there are tools which I found really fantastic by an institution called the European Investment Council, EIC, to support startups, and European startups are benefiting from that quite a bit. probably I'd say for the sector, there's a fair balance. Different sources of funding, public and private, but definitely Asia, Europe, and America are in the race. It's very clear to us and to me that the race is not, it's not too late for Europe, let's put it that way. We can win, and Europe can win. There are very strong companies like QM, Pascal, and quantum computing, for example. I've mentioned companies in software and application, quantum communications as well. Again, maybe the thing to focus on, that's where it's where the risk lies is really growth capital, later stage deep tech growth capital. I think governments are aware of that. We have an interest as a fund in developing actually a fund that could fund this part of the life of the companies. We are early stage investors with our fund 1, our fund 2, that we are currently closing, but we're getting also in the future, we will want to develop a late stage growth fund in order to precisely address that, bringing private capital to European startups at a late stage where they suffer a little bit with respect to international competition. But the science, the technology, the capacities, the people, the talent pool in Europe is really very strong. I mean, I've not seen in a way our portfolio companies suffering from a lack of talent in quantum. Everybody asks me that, but I mean, there are really excellent and quite many very good quantum universities with quantum programs in Europe, and they're feeding these startups, and that's super important. I used to say in the past, it's not too late, it's not too early anymore, and it's not too late yet. I think, while still true, I think people have realized that was the time to get in, private and public investors. It's definitely not too late for Europe to build champions with the capacity to be leaders, but not only in Europe, global leaders. I mean, selling their machines in all parts of the world.
All right, now I want to ask you a final question, and that is to the LPs that are listening in, to the founders that are building and listening now today, what's the message you want to leave with them? What's the most important thing we remember going out of this episode?
Quantum is not science fiction anymore. If you have that in mind, I think it's wrong. Quantum is real in the sense of you have companies, you have strong ecosystems developing machines, products. It's not just science anymore. And these products are not 5 or 10 years away. They're being deployed. There are companies generating revenues, substantial revenues already, raising money and positioning themselves. These companies will be worth billions over the next couple of years. I mean, there's a couple of public companies in the US, in particular, that have gone through SPACs a couple of years ago to get funded. And people have some views on SPACs, but the truth is they are successful now, and they're raising a pretty big amount of money on the market. There are in our portfolio, but elsewhere as well, many interesting companies in quantum, early stage, late stage. You can invest in Qubit, in the technology itself that's at the core of the quantum computers. But if you are a little bit more, let's say, agnostic, you can invest also in the quantum internet, for example, connecting these machines or enabling technologies, components, lasers, memories, things like that. You can invest in applications. The software layer with companies like Multiverse or Qubit Pharmaceuticals, HQS in Germany that I mentioned earlier. You can invest in cryptography. It's very vast, actually. Quantonation, we have all of these examples, and good examples, of course, of all of these companies. But I think now for investors, it's a very interesting time because science is done. People are working on applications. Let's say it's not too late to get into good prices for these companies when you invested early on. Of course, you want to invest in NVIDIA before it gets to be a $1 trillion company. And that's a little bit where we are. I mean, invest in NVIDIA like 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So for quantum, same situation. Invest today.
Then you have to go find a graphic cards maker and invest in hardware for games.
Yes, that's probably not it. But look at Beautiful, for example. I think that's a good example. They found an application that's really massive, actually. And it was not necessarily anticipated. It was not anticipated when we did our investment in 2020. We had something else in mind. And that's the beauty of investing in quantum startups, and in particular in quantum. I think we don't. It's something that's worries people a little bit sometimes. We don't have a very clear view of the applications. But on the other end, I think we underestimate completely the impact this will have. Because again, I mean, quantum mechanics is the operating system of the world. The world works along the rules of quantum mechanics. And of course, that's my very deep conviction. Of course, you want to build technology that is running on the OS, not the only 19th century OS, but on the 21st century OS. Might take a bit of time, but we're there. And I think that's the message. These companies are not pure science anymore. They're working on applications that will ultimately have an impact on everybody's life. And now's the time to invest.
Christophe, you have absolutely blown my mind today, and you have also set the scene for a Friday that will lead me into a weekend where I'll be watching things like the Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and and a bunch of other movies that take a bit more of a pothead approach to quantum. But I am absolutely now convinced that quantum is definitely a space that anyone looking for exposure to the next thing in venture probably should be thinking about. Christophe, thank you so much for joining me on the pod today.
Thanks, Andreas.
This was their finest hour.
Tear down this wall.
It's more than just an alliance. This is a union of values.
Let's start acting.